Back in the day, we all knew about the popular games. Heck, that's a big reason why they were popular. All the attention we were giving them. Some managed to hang on to that popularity over the years, while others didn't have quite the same luck. Well, while the high school quarterbacks of the gaming world had their time to shine, some of the awkward introverts getting their heads swirled in the toilets have finally emerged to have their day in the sun. Anybody who likes a good redemption story is in luck. In some ways, it's where a lot of the beauty of retro gaming comes from. I've always thought of retro gaming as an effort to go back through gaming's past with a fine-tooth comb, where every game gets a second chance, whether it got a first chance or not. If something good was missed, the retro gaming community will find it and start spreading the word through message boards, YouTube videos, word of mouth, people spending entire afternoons cold calling people at random, all the usual ways people like to share their passion for something. Who would have thought that companies' entire marketing departments could be less effective than just waiting decades later for enthusiasts to do it? Now, of course, this doesn't mean every game that gets a second chance is all of a sudden popular. Some games could be given a third chance, fourth chance, fifth chance, however many chances you want, and still come up empty. Although, you never know what the future might bring for the games you like that still go under the radar. I know some fans are still holding out for Mr. Nuts to get his big break eventually. I should also point out that this practice of going through gaming's history with a fine-tooth comb is probably some of the best evidence that I can give for why retro gaming isn't just purely nostalgia-based. Yeah, nostalgia certainly plays a role, but many gamers are looking for games they've never played before. And I feel like the proof is in the pudding. Otherwise, the games that weren't given a chance back in the day wouldn't be given a chance now. We're not just a bunch of fools wearing nostalgia glasses. We know how to remove them, and we'd like our respect. When it comes to games that are more popular now than they were when they first came out, the game that might just be the poster child for this is Earthbound, which, fittingly enough, stars an actual child, Ness, everybody's favorite baseball bat-wielding boy. Now, I can't speak for everybody, but I first heard about Ness in Super Smash Bros. For Nintendo 64. Although, you know what? Screw it. Speaking for other people, this is definitely how a lot of people first heard about Ness as well. You're going through the roster, and it's all the usual suspects. Maybe some people haven't heard of Captain Falcon, but who the heck is this boy? Is this like the game designer's kid or something? Come to find, he's from a game called Earthbound. But even for those who had heard of Earthbound back when it came out on Super Nintendo, many people still ignored it at the time. Remember, this was prior to Final Fantasy VII, so the explosion in popularity that RPGs would experience out west hadn't occurred yet. And even amongst those who did play RPGs at that point, this was a very different kind of RPG in terms of theme and setting. Most RPGs had worlds that were high fantasy, which could be argued was a huge part of their appeal. And that's not to say that RPG players couldn't get into Earthbound because they thought, wait a minute, this doesn't make me feel dorky enough. I don't think I like this. And remember, I use the word dorky with love, but Earthbound was just drastically different, even besides being what could be considered more so low fantasy, in which fantastical elements appear in our own world. Speaking of which, Earthbound is basically a Japanese man, to be specific, the writer Shigesato Itoi, and his commentary on US culture. Personally, that's always been what made the game most interesting to me. There's more to it than that, of course. Psychic powers, saving the world, autographed banana peels, that sounds like a keeper. But I've got a question for you. What exactly did this tell you back in the day? Sure, this cover art makes for a very recognizable retro gaming collectible nowadays, but back in the day, this was probably pretty ambiguous to most potential buyers. What was far less ambiguous was the cover art of Demon's Crest. Nothing says Nintendo like demons. Why is his skin shiny? And not only that, but this game is an offshoot of a different series, Ghosts and Goblins, which is fairly well known, sure, but not as popular as a lot of other series that are deemed popular enough to get offshoots. Although, funny enough, Demon's Crest is the third game in its own series, but those games weren't exactly multi-million sellers sellers themselves and were called Gargoyles Quest. Maybe people didn't make the connection? What might have done the best job of making a connection for people is if they knew that Firebrand, the main character in the game, was the super annoying enemy from the Ghosts and Goblins series. Maybe they could have added a subtitle to clue people in? I have a feeling that the idea was to rebrand the game as Demon's Crest because the Gargoyles Quest branding wasn't very effective anyways, but the new branding just never caught on. Well, luckily us retro gamers have a bag full of tricks for sniffing out the good games, and one of those tricks is a little something we like to call, if it says Capcom on it, it's probably good. When you see those yellow letters outlined in blue, or white letters outlined in red, I guess, you know you're cooking with gas now. There's certain companies that retro gamers just feel like they can trust. No joke, I sometimes list Treasure's phone number as my emergency contact for things. But with a company like Capcom's track record, retro gamers naturally become curious about the games they made that aren't Mega Man, Street Fighter, Resident Evil, or any of the other games they've already heard of. At the top of the heap is Demon's Crest. The game itself is a bit unconventional in terms of style. I've always described it as a mix between Mega Man X and Symphony of the Night, although most people would probably say it's not quite as good as either of those, but still, it has its fans, and for what it's worth, I've beaten it and really loved it. Alright, so far I've mostly been singling out individual games, but if we want to knock out a bunch of games all in one fell swoop, how about the Sega Saturn's entire library? Well, certainly a lot of the exclusives at least. People really crapped on this thing back in the day, and I've always blamed this guy. I mean, what kind of marketing is this? Japan has a guy who hikes across the land with a giant Saturn on his back for their marketing, Segata Sanshiro, who, funny enough, is far more popular now in the West than anything from the commercials we got here. Sorry, weird guy. But as for the console and games themselves, it should be noted that it may not be quite as popular these days as some people think, only due to shortage of supply. Not that there aren't ways to play Sega Saturn without original consoles and games, but not everyone wants to play via those methods, and as a result you have a lot of people turning down the Saturn nowadays due to cost. Definitely a bit of a shame. The Saturn, like Sega's other consoles, had Sega games on it. Shocking, I know. And where you find Sega games, you often find games that are creative and awesome. Sure, not everybody likes them, but heck, not everybody likes something like S'mores either, believe it or not. And among the people who do like the Sega games on Sega Saturn, they tend to really like them. And while I mentioned Segata Sanshiro, he's not the only thing from Japan that people love when it comes to the Sega Saturn. There's also a lot of games that remained exclusive to Japan. Naturally, with the increase in popularity of importing Japanese games, some of those Japanese games themselves, and especially the more sought after ones, could be considered far more popular now among Western audiences. I mean, when people collect for the Saturn, oftentimes they're looking to collect imports, and something like Radiant Silvergun is one of the first games to be recommended. Although, funny enough, this really isn't a game for everyone. I mean, shoot 'em ups are already sort of a niche genre to begin with, and Radiant Silvergun is a very unconventional shoot 'em up. I suppose its originality could be why it appeals to non-shoot 'em up players though. Still, it kind of feels like recommending bananas to people who don't eat fruit, which I do that anyways. I'd also like to point out that when it comes to games that are more popular now than they were back in the day, it doesn't always necessarily have to be games that weren't popular at all back in the day. For example, when Majora's Mask was first released on Nintendo 64, not the 3DS like I have here, it was still really popular at the time. I mean, it's a major Zelda game for crying out loud. But back then there were far less people regarding it as the most unique Zelda game that is actually the best Zelda game like you'll find today, and a lot more people saying this is weird, it's not Ocarina of Time, Tingle makes me uncomfortable. I don't think it's necessarily shocking that games could become more popular or less popular over time. I mean, that's how the world works, things change. I do, however, feel like our perspective of these older games now is far more accurate overall. if only because we've had more time to let our opinions form and develop perspective in relation to other games. How well these games hold up seems to really matter. The longer a game can be considered good, the closer it gets to being considered timeless. I think that's part of the appeal of retro gaming in a lot of ways. Not many things can remain good for decades, something we all struggle with in our own way. It's like, whoa, this is still considered great all these years later? Must be one heck of a game. But with that said, it's time to turn things over to all of you. For this question, I thought it might be fun for all of you to give an example of a game you felt was good at the time it came out, and it wasn't until later everyone else started saying it was good. That's right, I'm giving you permission to pound your chest and say, I tried to tell y'all and you didn't listen. For me, it's just the GameCube overall. So with that, leave your answers or anything else you'd like to say, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah. And he's talking about video games. He's the retro bird, oh yes. And he hopes that you like